Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her reading glasses and leaned closer to the computer screen, studying the digitized photograph that had arrived in her inbox that morning. As the lead researcher at the Historical Artifacts Authentication Institute at Cambridge University, she had seen thousands of old photographs, but something about this particular image made her pause. The photograph was dated 1918, taken in what appeared to be a modest farmhouse somewhere in rural England. The sepia tones had faded with age, but the image was remarkably clear for something over a century old. In the center of the frame stood a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tousled brown hair and serious dark eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. He was dressed in the simple clothing typical of working-class children of the era, worn trousers, a patched shirt, and suspenders that looked too large for his small frame. But it wasn't the boy himself that had caught Sarah's attention. It was what he was holding. In his small hands, clutched against his chest like a precious treasure, was an object that at first glance appeared to be a child's toy. It was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a small telescope, with intricate metalwork visible along its surface. The craftsmanship was clearly exceptional, even in the grainy photograph, with what appeared to be delicate engravings and possibly gemstone inlays catching the light. The photograph had been submitted by Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman from Yorkshire who had inherited it from her grandmother's estate. According to the accompanying letter, the boy in the photograph was her great-uncle, Thomas Whitmore, who had died in the influenza pandemic of 1919, just a year after the photograph was taken. The family always said little Tommy had found some sort of toy in the old ruins near our farm, Mrs. Hartwell had written in her careful, spidery handwriting. But looking at this photograph now with modern eyes, I'm beginning to wonder if it wasn't a toy at all. The craftsmanship looks far too sophisticated for a child's plaything, doesn't it? I thought perhaps your institute might be able to shed some light on what Tommy was actually holding. Sarah printed the photograph and pinned it to her bulletin board, then reached for her phone to call her colleague, Dr. Marcus Webb, who specialized in medieval and Renaissance artifacts. "Marcus, I need you to take a look at something," she said when he answered. "Can you come to my office? I think we might have stumbled onto something rather extraordinary." 20 minutes later, Marcus stood beside Sarah's desk, studying the photograph with the same intense concentration she had shown earlier. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that made him one of the most respected artifact specialists in Europe. "Fascinating," he murmured, pulling out a magnifying glass to examine the details more closely. "The metalwork is definitely not consistent with early 20th century toy manufacturing. Look at these engravings. They appear to be far older, possibly medieval or even earlier." "That's what I thought," Sarah agreed. "But what would a child in 1918 be doing with a medieval artifact, and where would he have found it?" Marcus set down the magnifying glass and looked at her with growing excitement. "Sarah, I think we need to contact Mrs. Hartwell immediately. We need to know everything about where this photograph was taken, and especially about these old ruins," she mentioned. The next morning, Sarah found herself driving through the Yorkshire countryside toward the small village of Thornfield, where Mrs. Hartwell lived. The landscape was beautiful in the way that only the English countryside could be, with rolling green hills dotted with stone walls and ancient oak trees. But Sarah's mind was focused on the mystery of the photograph and the object that young Thomas Whitmore had been holding. Mrs. Hartwell's cottage was a charming stone building that looked as if it had been standing for centuries. The elderly woman who answered the door was exactly what Sarah had expected from her letter. Small and neat, with silver hair pulled back in a tidy bun, and bright, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Dr. Chen, how wonderful to meet you in person," Mrs. Hartwell said, ushering Sarah into a cozy sitting room filled with antique furniture and family photographs. I must admit, I'm quite excited about your interest in our old family photograph. I've always wondered about that strange object Tommy was holding. Sarah accepted a cup of tea and settled into a comfortable armchair. Mrs. Hartwell, could you tell me more about your great-uncle Thomas, and especially about where this photograph was taken? Mrs. Hartwell's eyes grew distant as she reached back into family memory. Tommy was my grandmother's youngest brother. By all accounts, he was a bright, curious child, always exploring and getting into mischief. The photograph was taken at the old family farm, which has been in our family for generations. It's about 5 miles from here, though the farmhouse itself was torn down in the 1960s. And the ruins you mentioned in your letter. Ah, yes. There are, or were, the remains of what we always assumed was an old monastery on the property. Most of it had crumbled away by Tommy's time, but there were still some stone foundations and part of what might have been a chapel. The children were always warned to stay away from the ruins because they were dangerous, but you know how children are. Sarah leaned forward with interest. Do you know anything about the history of this monastery, when it might have been built, or what order of monks might have lived there? Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. I'm afraid not much. The family stories were always vague about the details. But I do remember my grandmother saying that the ruins were very old, possibly dating back to before the Norman conquest. There were always rumors in the village about the place being haunted or cursed or some such nonsense. And Tommy found this object in the ruins? According to family legend, yes. The story goes that he was playing near the ruins one day when he found it buried in what might have been the old chapel. He brought it home and refused to be parted from it. My grandmother said he carried it everywhere, claimed it was his special treasure. Sarah studied the photograph again, noting the way the boy held the object, not casually, as a child might hold a toy, but protectively, almost reverently. What happened to the object after Tommy died? Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew sad. That's the tragic part of the story. Tommy died in the influenza pandemic, as I mentioned. He was sick for several days, and in his delirium, he kept talking about his treasure and how important it was to keep it safe. But when he died, the object was nowhere to be found. The family searched everywhere, but it had simply vanished. Vanished? How is that possible? No one knew. Some thought perhaps Tommy had hidden it somewhere before he became too ill. Others wondered if someone had taken it, though who would want what appeared to be a child's toy? It became one of those family mysteries that gets talked about for generations but never solved. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon with Mrs. Hartwell, going through old family documents and photographs, looking for any additional clues about the mysterious object. She found several more photographs of Tommy, but none that showed the object as clearly as the original. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell walked her to the door. Dr. Chen, do you really think Tommy's toy might have been something important? I think it's quite possible, Sarah replied carefully. The craftsmanship visible in the photograph suggests it was made by highly skilled artisans, possibly centuries ago. If it was found in the ruins of an ancient monastery, it could be a significant historical artifact. And if it is, what would that mean? Sarah considered the question. It could mean that your family property contains one of the most important archaeological sites in England. Medieval monasteries were often repositories for valuable religious artifacts, manuscripts, and treasures. If there's one significant artifact, there could be others. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes widened. You mean there might be more treasures buried in the ruins? It's possible. Mrs. Hartwell, would you be willing to allow our institute to conduct an archaeological survey of the property? We would need to use ground-penetrating radar and possibly do some limited excavation. The elderly woman was quiet for a moment, considering. The property doesn't belong to me anymore, I'm afraid. It was sold out of the family in the 1970s, but I could put you in touch with the current owners. They're a lovely couple who've always been interested in the history of the place. As Sarah drove back to Cambridge that evening, her mind was racing with possibilities. If the object in the photograph was indeed a medieval artifact, And if it had been found in the ruins on the Hartwell property, then they might be looking at one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in recent years. But first, she needed to learn more about the object itself. The photograph, while clear, only showed one angle, and there were details that were impossible to make out in the sepia tones. She needed to find out more about what exactly young Tommy Whitmore had been holding in that photograph from 1918. Back in her office, Sarah began researching the history of monasteries in Yorkshire, looking for any that might have existed on or near the Hartwell property. She also reached out to colleagues who specialized in medieval religious artifacts, sending them copies of the photograph and asking for their opinions on what the object might be. The responses began coming in the next day, and they were more intriguing than Sarah had dared to hope. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a specialist in medieval religious artifacts at Oxford, was the first to respond. "Sarah, this is extraordinary. The object appears to be some sort of reliquary, a container used to hold religious relics. The craftsmanship suggests it's very old, possibly 12th or 13th century. If this is authentic, it could be incredibly valuable, both historically and monetarily." Dr. James Fletcher, an expert in medieval metalwork, was even more specific. The engravings visible in the photograph are consistent with Anglo-Saxon or early Norman craftsmanship. The style of the metalwork suggests it might be a processional cross or possibly a container for holy relics. This could be a museum-quality piece. But it was the response from Dr. Margaret Thornton, a specialist in medieval manuscripts and religious artifacts, that made Sarah's heart race. "Sarah, I think you may have found something truly remarkable. The object in the photograph bears a striking resemblance to descriptions of the lost Thornfield reliquary, a legendary artifact that disappeared during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. If this is the same object, you're looking at one of the most important religious artifacts in English history." Sarah stared at the email, hardly believing what she was reading. The Thornfield reliquary was the stuff of legend among medieval historians, a priceless artifact that had supposedly contained a fragment of the true cross and had been lost for over 400 years. She picked up the photograph of young Tommy Whitmore, studying his serious face and the way he held the mysterious object. Had this 8-year-old boy really found one of the most important religious artifacts in English history? And if so, where was it now? The mystery was deepening, and Sarah knew that finding the answers would require all of her skills as a researcher and historian. But she also knew that this could be the discovery of a lifetime, not just for her, but for the entire field of medieval studies. As she looked at the photograph one more time, she made a silent promise to young Tommy Whitmore, who had died over a century ago. She would find out what he had been holding, and she would make sure the world knew the truth about his toy. The investigation was just beginning. Dr. Sarah Chen spent the next 3 days immersed in medieval manuscripts and historical records, trying to piece together the story of the legendary Thornfield reliquary. What she discovered was a tale of faith, power, and loss that stretched back nearly 1,000 years. The Thornfield reliquary had been created in the late 12th century for the Benedictine monastery of St. Aldrich, which had stood on what was now the Hartwell property. According to the surviving records, the reliquary had been commissioned by Abbot William de Thornfield to house what was believed to be a fragment of the true cross, brought back from the Holy Land by a Crusader knight. The reliquary itself was described in contemporary accounts as a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship. Made of silver and gold, it was adorned with precious gems and intricate engravings depicting scenes from the life of Christ. But more than its material value, the reliquary was considered one of the most sacred objects in northern England, drawing pilgrims from across Europe who came to venerate the holy relic it contained. For over 3 centuries, the Thornfield reliquary had been the centerpiece of the monastery's spiritual life. But in 1536, during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, St. Aldrich's had been closed and its treasures confiscated by the crown. According to the official records, all valuable items had been seized and melted down for their precious metals. But there had always been rumors that some of the monastery's most precious artifacts had been hidden before the king's commissioners arrived. Local legends spoke of monks who had buried treasures in secret locations, hoping to preserve them until the religious persecution ended and the monasteries could be restored. Sarah was deep in her research when her phone rang. It was Dr. Margaret Thornton from the British Museum. "Sarah, I've been thinking about that photograph you sent me," Margaret said without preamble. "I've been going through our archives, and I found something that might interest you." "What kind of something?" "A manuscript from the 16th century, written by a monk named Brother Benedict, who was at St. Aldrich's when it was dissolved. He describes hiding several precious artifacts, including what he calls the sacred vessel of the true cross. The description matches what we know about the Thornfield reliquary." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Does he say where he hid it?" "That's the frustrating part. He's deliberately vague, probably to protect the location in case the manuscript fell into the wrong hands. But he does mention the sacred ground beneath the altar stone and where the blessed St. Aldrich first prayed." "The chapel ruins," Sarah murmured. "Tommy found it in what might have been the old chapel." "Exactly what I was thinking. Sarah, if that boy really did find the Thornfield reliquary, we're talking about one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in British history." After hanging up, Sarah immediately called Mrs. Hartwell to get the contact information for the current owners of the property. She needed to get permission to conduct a proper archaeological survey, and she needed it quickly. The current owners, David and Emma Richardson, turned out to be a retired couple in their 60s who had bought the property in the 1970s and had always been fascinated by its history. When Sarah explained what she believed Tommy Whitmore might have found in 1918, they were more than willing to allow a full archaeological investigation. "We've always known there was something special about this place," Emma Richardson told Sarah when they met at the property the following week. "We found bits of old pottery and stone carvings over the years, but nothing like what you're describing." The Richardsons led Sarah to the ruins, which were more extensive than she had expected. The foundation stones of what had clearly been a substantial church were still visible, along with the remains of several other buildings that had probably been the monastery's living quarters, kitchen, and scriptorium. "The family stories always said that Tommy found his toy somewhere around here," David Richardson said, gesturing toward the area that had once been the chapel's altar. "There's a large flat stone there that we've always assumed was part of the original altar." Sarah knelt beside the stone, running her hands over its weathered surface. It was clearly very old, with carved symbols that were barely visible after centuries of exposure to the elements. But as she studied it more closely, she could make out what appeared to be a cross and some Latin text. "This is definitely the original altar stone," she said with growing excitement. "And if Brother Benedict's manuscript is accurate, this is exactly where we should be looking." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah assembled a team of archaeologists and brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment to survey the area around the chapel ruins. The initial scans were promising, revealing what appeared to be a void beneath the altar stone, possibly a hidden chamber or crypt. The excavation began on a crisp October morning, exactly 107 years after the photograph of Tommy Whitmore had been taken. Sarah and her team worked carefully, removing centuries of accumulated soil and debris from around the altar stone. It was Dr. Marcus Webb who made the crucial discovery. As they carefully lifted the massive altar stone using a crane, he spotted something glinting in the earth beneath. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called out, his voice tight with excitement. Sarah hurried over to where Marcus was kneeling beside a small cavity that had been revealed beneath the altar stone. Inside the cavity, wrapped in what appeared to be the rotted remains of cloth, were several objects that made her heart race. The largest was clearly the object from the photograph, the cylindrical artifact that young Tommy Whitmore had been holding. Even covered in centuries of dirt, the intricate metalwork was clearly visible, along with what appeared to be gemstones set into the surface. But there were other objects as well: a small golden chalice, several pieces of jewelry that looked like they might have been ecclesiastical ornaments, and what appeared to be a small leather-bound book. "My God," Sarah whispered, hardly believing what she was seeing. "It's all here. Brother Benedict really did hide the monastery's treasures." The team worked with painstaking care to remove the artifacts from their hiding place. Each item was carefully photographed in situ before being lifted out and placed in protective containers for transport to the laboratory. But it was when they finally had the reliquary in the lab and began the delicate process of cleaning away centuries of accumulated dirt that the true magnitude of their discovery became clear. The Thornfield reliquary was even more beautiful than the historical descriptions had suggested. Made of silver and gold, it stood about 8 inches tall and was covered in intricate engravings depicting scenes from the crucifixion and resurrection. Precious stones, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires were set into the metalwork, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the laboratory walls. But it was what they found inside the reliquary that truly took Sarah's breath away. When they carefully opened the artifact, they discovered a small crystal vial containing what appeared to be a tiny piece of wood. Attached to the vial was a small parchment written in Latin that identified the relic as a fragment of the true cross, blessed by Pope Urban III in 1187. "Whether or not this is actually a piece of the true cross is almost beside the point," Sarah explained to the assembled team of researchers. "What matters is that medieval people believed it was, and they created this extraordinary work of art to house it." Dr. Margaret Thornton, who had flown up from London to see the discovery, was equally amazed. "This is museum quality," she said, studying the reliquary under a magnifying glass. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. This would have been one of the most valuable objects in medieval England." But as exciting as the discovery was, it also raised new questions. How had 8-year-old Tommy Whitmore managed to find the hidden chamber that had eluded treasure hunters and archaeologists for centuries? And what had happened to the reliquary after he died? The answer to the first question came from Mrs. Hartwell, who had driven over to see the excavation site. "I remember my grandmother telling me that Tommy was always digging around the ruins," she said, studying the cavity beneath the altar stone. "She said he was convinced there was treasure buried there, though the adults always dismissed it as a child's imagination. I suppose he must have found a way to move that stone, small as he was." "But how?" Sarah wondered. "That stone weighs at least half a ton." David Richardson, who had been listening to the conversation, suddenly looked thoughtful. "You know, there was a terrible storm in the autumn of 1918. I remember reading about it in the local newspaper archives. Trees were blown down, roofs were damaged. It's possible that the storm might have shifted the altar stone enough for a small boy to see what was underneath." That explanation made sense, but it still didn't answer the question of what had happened to the reliquary after Tommy's death. If he had hidden it somewhere before he became ill, where could it have been? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Sarah was packing up her equipment at the end of the day, Mrs. Hartwell approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Dr. Chen, I've been thinking about something my grandmother used to say. She always claimed that Tommy had told her just before he died that he had put his treasure somewhere safe, somewhere where the angels would watch over it." "The angels?" Sarah repeated. "Yes. At the time, everyone assumed he was delirious from the fever. But now I'm wondering, there's an old stone angel in the churchyard at Thornfield Village. It marks the grave of the last abbot of St. Aldrich's. Tommy used to play there sometimes." Sarah felt a chill of excitement. "Mrs. Hartwell, would you be willing to show me this angel?" An hour later, they stood in the ancient churchyard of Thornfield Village before a weathered stone angel that marked the grave of Abbot Thomas de Montfort, the last abbot of St. Aldrich's Monastery. The angel was beautiful despite its age, with outstretched wings and a serene expression that seemed to watch over the graves around it. Tommy always said the angel was his friend, Mrs. Hartwell said softly. He would sit here for hours, talking to it. Sarah walked around the monument, studying it carefully. The base was solid stone, but as she examined it more closely, she noticed that one of the stones seemed slightly different from the others. Newer, perhaps, or at least disturbed more recently than the rest. Mrs. Hartwell, do you think the church would give us permission to examine this monument more closely? I'm sure they would, especially given what you've discovered today. The next morning, with permission from the local vicar, Sarah and her team carefully examined the base of the Angel Monument. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected what appeared to be a small cavity behind the newer-looking stone. When they carefully removed the stone, they found a small space that had clearly been created recently, probably within the last century. And inside that space, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture, was the Thornfield Reliquary. A note, written in a child's careful handwriting, was wrapped around the artifact. For the angels to keep safe until I come back. Tommy Whitmore, 1918. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she read the note. This 8-year-old boy, dying of influenza, had somehow understood that his toy was something precious that needed to be protected. In his final days, he had managed to hide it in the one place he felt it would be truly safe, under the protection of the stone angel that had been his friend. As they carefully lifted the reliquary from its hiding place, Sarah couldn't help but think about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A curious boy, a terrible storm, a deadly pandemic, and a family photograph that had survived for over a century, all had played a part in the rediscovery of one of England's greatest lost treasures. The Thornfield Reliquary would soon take its place in the British Museum, where it would be studied by scholars and admired by visitors from around the world. But Sarah knew that the real hero of this story was young Tommy Whitmore, who had recognized the importance of what he had found and had given his life to protect it. The toy that had captivated an 8-year-old boy in 1918 was indeed one of the most precious artifacts in English history, and thanks to his courage and wisdom, it had finally come home. The discovery of the Thornfield Reliquary sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, but for Dr. Sarah Chen, it was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. As she and her team continued to excavate the monastery ruins, they uncovered evidence that St. Aldrich's had been far more than just another medieval religious house. The small leather-bound book they had found alongside the reliquary proved to be the key to understanding the monastery's true significance. Written in a mixture of Latin and Old English, it appeared to be a chronicle kept by the monks of St. Aldrich's, documenting not just their daily religious activities, but also their role as guardians of some of the most important artifacts in medieval Europe. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the medieval manuscript specialist from Oxford, had been working around the clock to translate the chronicle. What she discovered was extraordinary. Sarah, this isn't just a monastery record, she explained during a video call from her office at Oxford. It's a catalogue of treasures. St. Aldrich's wasn't just a religious house, it was a secret repository for artifacts that were considered too precious or too dangerous to be kept in more public locations. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, fascinated. What kind of artifacts? Religious relics, certainly, but also items that the church considered problematic. There are references to the cup of the heretic king, the bones of the false prophet, and the stone that weeps blood. These monks weren't just preserving Orthodox Christian artifacts, they were hiding things that the church wanted to keep secret. The implications were staggering. If Elizabeth's translation was accurate, then St. Aldrich's had been a medieval equivalent of a classified government warehouse, storing artifacts that were too controversial or too powerful to be displayed publicly. There's more, Elizabeth continued. The chronicle mentions that the monastery was chosen for this role because of its remote location and because of something called the blessing of St. Aldrich himself. Apparently, the saint who founded the monastery in the 8th century had some kind of special ability to, well, the text is unclear, but it suggests he could see beyond the veil of time. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You mean they thought he was psychic? It's possible. Medieval people had very different ideas about what we would now call supernatural abilities. They might have believed that St. Aldrich could predict which artifacts would be important in the future or which ones posed spiritual dangers. This revelation cast young Tommy Whitmore's discovery in an entirely new light. Had he simply stumbled upon the reliquary by chance, or had there been something more at work? The fact that he had immediately recognized its importance despite being only 8 years old seemed almost supernatural in itself. Sarah decided to delve deeper into the history of St. Aldrich himself. What she found was a figure shrouded in legend and mystery, even by medieval standards. St. Aldrich had been a Saxon monk who had founded his monastery in 782 AD during the reign of King Offa of Mercia. According to the surviving accounts, he had been known for his ability to find lost objects and his uncanny knack for predicting future events. The local population had revered him as a holy man, and after his death, pilgrims had come from across England to pray at his tomb. But there were also darker stories. Some accounts suggested that Aldrich had been involved in pagan practices before his conversion to Christianity, and that he had retained some of his old knowledge even after taking holy vows. There were whispers that he could speak with the dead, that he could see visions of the future, and that he had hidden powerful artifacts in secret locations around his monastery. As Sarah researched deeper, she began to notice a pattern. Throughout history, there had been reports of people finding unusual objects in the area around the monastery ruins. A farmer in the 17th century had supposedly discovered a golden chalice while ploughing his fields. A Victorian antiquarian had claimed to have found ancient coins and jewelry in the area, and now, in the 20th century, young Tommy Whitmore had uncovered the Thornfield reliquary. Was it possible that St. Aldrich had hidden multiple caches of artifacts around his monastery, and that some supernatural force was guiding people to discover them when the time was right? Sarah was pondering this question when she received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Hartwell. "Dr. Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling," the elderly woman said, "but I've been going through more of my grandmother's papers, and I found something that might interest you." "What kind of something?" "A diary entry from 1918, written by my great-grandmother just after Tommy died. She mentions something strange that happened during his illness." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of strange?" According to the diary, Tommy kept talking about the old monk who had shown him where to find his treasure. At first, the family thought he was delirious from the fever, but he was very specific about the details. He said the monk had appeared to him in a dream and had led him to the altar stone. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Did he describe this monk? Yes, and that's the really odd part. Tommy described him as wearing brown robes and having a kind face with bright blue eyes. But here's the thing. That description matches the traditional depictions of St. Aldrich perfectly. There's a medieval painting of him in the village church that shows him with exactly those features. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her office, staring at the photograph of Tommy Whitmore that still hung on her bulletin board. The boy's serious expression seemed to hold secrets that she was only beginning to understand. She decided to visit the village church to see the painting of St. Aldrich that Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Thornfield was a small but ancient building with parts dating back to the Norman period. The painting of St. Aldrich hung in a small side chapel, and Sarah gasped when she saw it. The saint was depicted as a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle expression, wearing the brown robes of a Benedictine monk. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They were painted in a brilliant blue, that seemed almost to glow in the dim light of the chapel. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see an elderly man in clerical collar approaching. "I'm Father Michael, the vicar here. You must be Dr. Chen. Mrs. Hartwell told me you might be stopping by." "Father Michael, how old is this painting?" "It's believed to date from the 14th century, though it may be a copy of an even earlier work. The artist is unknown, but the quality is quite remarkable. St. Aldrich was very important to this community for many centuries." Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that a local boy described seeing someone who looked like this painting. "Do you know anything about that?" Father Michael's expression grew thoughtful. "You mean young Tommy Whitmore?" "Yes, I've heard that story. My predecessor here, Father James, actually visited the boy during his final illness. According to his notes, Tommy was quite insistent that he had been helped by the old monk to find his treasure. And what did Father James think about that?" "Well, Father James was a very practical man, not given to flights of fancy. But he did note in his journal that Tommy seemed remarkably calm and peaceful for a child who was dying. He said it was as if the boy knew something that gave him comfort." Sarah studied the painting more closely, noting the fine details of the saint's face. There was something about the expression that seemed almost alive, as if the painted eyes were watching her. "Father Michael, have there been other reports over the years of people seeing St. Aldrich or finding things in the area around the old monastery?" The vicar was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There have been incidents. Nothing that the church would officially recognize, you understand, but there have been reports. People claiming to have seen a monk in brown robes walking near the ruins. Others saying they've been guided to find lost objects. The church tends to be skeptical of such claims, but this community has a long memory, Dr. Chen. And sometimes, when you've lived in a place for as long as I have, you begin to think that there might be more to these old stories than simple superstition." That evening, Sarah returned to the excavation site to review the day's findings. Her team had uncovered more artifacts, medieval pottery, coins, and what appeared to be fragments of illuminated manuscripts. But as she worked alone in the gathering dusk, she found herself thinking about Tommy Whitmore and his mysterious encounter with the old monk. As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the ruins, Sarah could almost imagine what the monastery might have looked like in its heyday. The chapel would have been filled with the sound of chanting monks. The altar would have gleamed with gold and silver, and the air would have been heavy with incense and the weight of centuries of prayer. It was then that she noticed something odd. In the fading light, one of the stones in the chapel wall seemed to be glowing faintly. Sarah approached it cautiously, wondering if it was just a trick of the light, but as she got closer, she could see that there was definitely something unusual about this particular stone. Unlike the others, which were rough-hewn limestone, this stone appeared to be made of a different material, something that seemed to have a faint luminescence of its own, and carved into its surface, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a symbol that made Sarah's heart race. It was the same symbol that appeared on the Thornfield reliquary, a cross surrounded by a circle with strange markings that looked almost like ancient runes. Sarah carefully photographed the stone from every angle, then called Dr. Marcus Webb to ask him to bring some specialized lighting equipment to the site the next morning. If there were more hidden symbols or markings in the chapel walls, she wanted to find them. The next day's investigation revealed that the glowing stone was not alone. Using ultraviolet light, they discovered that several stones in the chapel walls contained similar symbols, all carved with the same mysterious markings that appeared on the reliquary. "It's like a code," Marcus observed, studying the patterns. "Or maybe a map. These symbols seem to be pointing towards specific locations." Sarah felt a growing excitement as she realized what they might have discovered. "Marcus, what if these symbols mark the locations of other hidden caches? What if St. Aldrich left a treasure map carved right into the walls of his chapel?" The possibility was tantalizing. If the chronicle was accurate, And St. Aldrich's monastery had indeed been a repository for dozens of precious artifacts, then there might be other treasures still waiting to be discovered. But as Sarah studied the symbols more closely, she began to notice something else. The markings weren't just random, they seemed to follow a pattern that corresponded to astronomical phenomena. The positions of the symbols matched the locations of certain stars and constellations as they would have appeared in the 8th century. This isn't just a treasure map, she realized with growing amazement. It's an astronomical calendar. St. Aldrich was using the positions of the stars to mark the locations of his hidden artifacts. The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, then St. Aldrich had been far more than just a simple monk. He had been a scholar, an astronomer, and possibly one of the most sophisticated treasure hunters in history. But more than that, he had created a system that would allow future generations to find his hidden artifacts, if they knew how to read the signs. And somehow, across the centuries, young Tommy Whitmore had been guided to one of those hiding places. As Sarah stood in the ruins of the ancient chapel, surrounded by the symbols that St. Aldrich had carved into stone over 1,200 years ago, she felt a connection to the past that was almost overwhelming. The boy in the 1918 photograph had been part of a story that stretched back through the centuries, a story of hidden treasures and ancient wisdom that was still unfolding, and she was determined to uncover all of its secrets. The astronomical connection that Dr. Sarah Chen had discovered in the chapel symbols opened up an entirely new dimension to the mystery of St. Aldrich's monastery. Working with Dr. James Hartley, an expert in medieval astronomy from Edinburgh University, Sarah began to decode the star map that the ancient saint had carved into the chapel walls. "This is absolutely remarkable," Dr. Hartley said, as he studied the symbols under specialized lighting. St. Aldrich wasn't just marking random locations, he was creating a sophisticated astronomical calendar that would remain accurate for centuries. The symbols, when properly interpreted, corresponded to specific celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and the positions of certain constellations at particular times of year. But more intriguingly, they seemed to indicate that the hidden artifacts could only be found at specific times, when the astronomical conditions were exactly right. It's like a cosmic lock, Sarah realized. The artifacts are hidden in places that can only be accessed when the stars align in specific ways. This discovery explained why Tommy Whitmore had found the Thornfield reliquary in 1918. According to Dr. Hartley's calculations, the autumn of 1918 had been marked by a rare astronomical event, a conjunction of Mars and Jupiter that occurred only once every few decades. The storm that had shifted the altar stone had happened during this conjunction, creating the perfect conditions for the boy to discover the hidden chamber. But the star map suggested that there were other artifacts still waiting to be found, each one hidden according to its own astronomical schedule. And according to the calculations, the next window of opportunity was approaching rapidly. "There's going to be a lunar eclipse next month," Dr. Hartley explained, pointing to one of the symbols on the chapel wall. "And if I'm reading this correctly, that eclipse will align with this symbol here, which seems to point toward the area that was once the monastery's scriptorium." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The scriptorium would have been where the monks copied manuscripts and created illuminated texts. If St. Aldrich had hidden artifacts there, they might include some of the most precious books and documents in medieval history. But as exciting as this discovery was, Sarah was also troubled by a growing sense that they were not the only ones interested in St. Aldrich's treasures. Over the past few days, she had noticed strangers in the village, well-dressed men who seemed to be asking questions about the excavation. And Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned that someone had been inquiring about the old family photographs, offering to buy them for unusually large sums of money. Sarah's concerns were confirmed when she arrived at the excavation site one morning to find that someone had been there during the night. Nothing had been stolen, but it was clear that the site had been searched by someone with professional skills. The intruders had been careful to cover their tracks, but they had left subtle signs that only an experienced archaeologist would notice. "We need security," Sarah told Marcus Webb as they surveyed the disturbed site. "Someone else knows about the artifacts, and they're not waiting for official permission to look for them." Marcus nodded grimly. "I'll contact the local police, but I think we need more than that. These people, whoever they are, seem to know what they're doing." That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her hotel. A well-dressed woman in her 50s knocked on her door, introducing herself as Dr. Victoria Sterling from a private antiquities research firm in London. "Dr. Chen, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Dr. Sterling said with a polished smile. "I represent some very interested parties who would like to discuss your recent discoveries." Sarah invited her in, but remained cautious. "What kind of interested parties?" "Collectors, museums, investors, people who understand the true value of what you found." "The Thornfield Reliquary is just the beginning, isn't it? There are other artifacts, other treasures waiting to be discovered." "How do you know that?" Dr. Sterling's smile never wavered. "Dr. Chen, you're not the first person to study the St. Aldrich site. There have been others over the years, researchers who have pieced together fragments of the puzzle. My clients have been following this story for a very long time." Sarah felt a chill of unease. "And what exactly do your clients want?" "Partnership, cooperation, the resources to properly excavate and preserve these artifacts. You're working with limited funding and university bureaucracy. We could offer you unlimited resources and complete freedom to pursue your research." "In exchange for what?" "Access to the artifacts, of course, and perhaps a more flexible approach to their final disposition." Sarah understood immediately what Dr. Sterling was really offering. These weren't legitimate researchers or museum representatives. They were treasure hunters, possibly connected to the illegal antiquities trade. They wanted to find St. Aldrich's artifacts and sell them to private collectors, removing them from public access forever. "I'm afraid I'm not interested," Sarah said firmly. "These artifacts belong in museums where they can be studied and appreciated by everyone." Dr. Sterling's smile became slightly less warm. "Dr. Chen, I hope you'll reconsider. My clients can be very persuasive, and they don't like to take no for an answer. It would be unfortunate if your excavation were to encounter difficulties." After Dr. Sterling left, Sarah immediately called the local police and reported the veiled threat. She also contacted her university's security department and arranged for professional guards to watch the excavation site around the clock. But she knew that the real race was against time. If her interpretation of the star map was correct, the lunar eclipse would provide the key to finding the next cache of artifacts. She had to find them before Dr. Sterling's clients did. Working with feverish intensity, Sarah and her team prepared for the eclipse excavation. According to the astronomical calculations, the eclipse would occur at 2:17 a.m. on October 31st, Halloween night, which seemed somehow appropriate for an excavation based on medieval mysticism. The symbol on the chapel wall pointed toward an area about 50 yards from the main monastery buildings, where ground-penetrating radar had detected what appeared to be the remains of a smaller structure. Historical records suggested this had been the scriptorium, where the monks had created and copied manuscripts. As the night of the eclipse approached, Sarah felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with unease. The security guards had reported seeing suspicious vehicles in the area, and there had been several attempts by unknown individuals to access the site during daylight hours. On the night of October 31st, Sarah and her core team gathered at the excavation site under a canopy of stars. The lunar eclipse was scheduled to begin at midnight, reaching totality just after 2 a.m. According to the star map, that was when the conditions would be perfect for finding whatever St. Aldrich had hidden in the scriptorium. As the Earth's shadow began to creep across the moon, Sarah felt an almost electric tension in the air. The security guards were positioned around the perimeter of the site, and Dr. Hartley was monitoring the astronomical conditions with precise instruments. "The eclipse is beginning," he announced as the moon started to darken. According to the calculations, we should start digging when the moon is completely in shadow. Sarah and Marcus began the careful excavation, using hand tools to avoid damaging any artifacts that might be buried in the scriptorium ruins. The work was slow and painstaking, made more difficult by the eerie red light of the eclipsed moon. It was just after 2 a.m. when Marcus's trowel struck something hard beneath the soil. "Sarah, I think we've found something." Working together, they carefully uncovered what appeared to be a stone box, similar to the one that had contained the Thornfield reliquary, but larger and more elaborate. The lid was carved with the same astronomical symbols they had found in the chapel, and it was sealed with what appeared to be medieval wax. But as they prepared to lift the stone box from its hiding place, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive crack of a rifle being fired. One of the security guards cried out, and she could see dark figures moving at the edge of the excavation site. "We're under attack," Marcus said grimly, reaching for his radio to call for backup. But before he could make the call, a voice called out from the darkness, "Dr. Chen, please step away from the artifact. We don't want anyone to get hurt, but we will take what we came for." Sarah recognized the voice. It was Dr. Sterling, but now her polished facade had been replaced by cold professionalism. She and her team had been waiting for this moment, probably watching the excavation for days and planning their assault. "You can't just steal these artifacts," Sarah called back. "They belong to history, to everyone. History is written by those who possess the artifacts, Dr. Chen. And tonight, that will be us." But as Dr. Sterling and her team moved closer to the excavation site, something extraordinary happened. The air around the stone box began to shimmer, and Sarah could swear she saw a figure materializing in the red light of the eclipsed moon. A man in brown robes with kind eyes and a gentle expression. It was the same figure that Tommy Whitmore had described seeing in 1918, the same face that appeared in the medieval painting in the village church. St. Aldrich himself seemed to be standing guard over his hidden treasures. Dr. Sterling and her team stopped in their tracks, staring at the apparition with expressions of shock and fear. Several of them dropped their weapons and backed away, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. "What is that?" one of them whispered. But Sarah felt no fear. Instead, she felt a sense of protection and guidance, as if the ancient saint was giving her permission to claim the artifacts he had hidden so many centuries ago. Working quickly while Dr. Sterling's team was distracted by the apparition, Sarah and Marcus lifted the stone box from its hiding place. It was heavier than they had expected, but they managed to carry it to their vehicle just as the local police arrived, responding to the security guard's call for help. Dr. Sterling and her team were arrested, and the stone box was transported safely to Sarah's laboratory. When they opened it the next day, they found treasures beyond their wildest dreams, illuminated manuscripts that had been lost for centuries, golden religious artifacts, and most remarkably, a detailed map showing the locations of dozens of other hidden caches throughout England. St. Aldrich had been far more than just a simple monk. He had been the guardian of a vast network of hidden treasures, artifacts that he had scattered across the country and protected with astronomical locks that would only open at specific times. But perhaps most importantly, they found a letter written in Latin by St. Aldrich himself, explaining his purpose and his methods. According to the letter, he had been guided by visions of the future, visions that showed him the importance of preserving these artifacts for generations yet to come. "I have seen the time when faith will be tested and knowledge will be threatened," the letter read. "In that time, these treasures will be needed to remind humanity of its spiritual heritage and its connection to the divine. I have hidden them not to hoard them, but to preserve them for those who will come after, those who will have the wisdom to use them properly." As Sarah read these words, she thought about young Tommy Whitmore, who had been chosen by forces beyond his understanding to be part of this ancient plan. The boy with his toy had been a guardian, just as St. Aldrich had been, protecting the treasures until the time was right for them to be revealed. The photograph from 1918 now took on an entirely new meaning. It wasn't just a picture of a child with an interesting object. It was a document of a sacred trust being passed from one generation to the next. A trust that had finally been fulfilled after more than a century. And Sarah knew that her work was far from over. The map they had found showed dozens of other locations, other treasures waiting to be discovered when the astronomical conditions were right. She had become part of St. Aldrich's grand design, a modern guardian of ancient wisdom. The boy in the photograph had started something that would continue for generations to come, ensuring that the treasures of the past would be preserved for the future. And somewhere, Sarah believed, the spirit of young Tommy Whitmore was smiling, knowing that his toy had finally revealed its true purpose. 6 months after the dramatic discovery during the lunar eclipse, Dr. Sarah Chen found herself standing in the British Museum, watching as visitors from around the world marveled at the newly opened Treasures of St. Aldrich exhibition. The Thornfield reliquary gleamed under the museum's carefully controlled lighting, surrounded by the other artifacts that had been recovered from the monastery ruins. But for Sarah, the most meaningful display was a simple glass case containing the 1918 photograph of Tommy Whitmore, positioned next to a detailed explanation of how the boy's discovery had led to one of the most significant archaeological finds in British history. "He looks so serious," said a voice beside her. Sarah turned to see Mrs. Hartwell, now in her 80s but still sharp and alert, studying the photograph of her great-uncle with obvious pride. "He was protecting something precious," Sarah replied. Even at 8 years old, he understood that what he had found was important. The exhibition had been a tremendous success, drawing scholars and visitors from around the world. But more importantly, it had sparked a new field of study that combined archaeology with astronomy, as researchers began to explore other sites where ancient peoples might have used celestial events to hide and protect valuable artifacts. The map found in the scriptorium had led to the discovery of 12 other caches of artifacts across England, each one hidden according to St. Aldrich's astronomical system. Museums throughout the country now housed treasures that had been lost for centuries, and scholars were rewriting the history of medieval England based on the new information these artifacts provided. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery had come from the detailed study of St. Aldrich's own writings, which had been found in the final cache discovered just the month before. The ancient saint's journals revealed that he had indeed possessed what could only be described as prophetic abilities, accurately predicting events that wouldn't occur for centuries after his death. Most remarkably, he had written specifically about Tommy Whitmore, describing a young guardian who will come in the time of great sickness when the world is torn by war and pestilence. The description was so accurate that it could only refer to the boy who had found the reliquary during the influenza pandemic of 1918. "He saw Tommy coming," Sarah had told the assembled scholars at the International Conference on Medieval Mysticism. Across 12 centuries, St. Aldrich knew that a specific child would find his treasures at exactly the right moment. The implications of this discovery had sent shockwaves through both the archaeological and religious communities. If St. Aldrich had truly been able to see the future, what did that say about the nature of time and destiny, and what other secrets might be hidden in the artifacts he had left behind? Dr. James Hartley, the astronomer who had helped decode the star map, had become obsessed with the question of whether St. Aldrich's prophetic abilities could be explained by science. Perhaps he wasn't seeing the future in a mystical sense, he theorized. Perhaps he had discovered some natural phenomenon that allowed him to calculate probable outcomes based on astronomical cycles. But Sarah was less interested in explaining the mystery than in following where it led. The final cache had contained not just artifacts, but also a new map, one that pointed to locations far beyond England. St. Aldrich's network of hidden treasures apparently extended across Europe and possibly beyond. He was part of something larger, Sarah explained to her research team as they planned their next expedition. A network of medieval scholars and mystics who were preserving knowledge and artifacts for future generations. We've only scratched the surface of what they accomplished. The next location on the map was a monastery in the Swiss Alps, where St. Aldrich had apparently sent some of his most precious artifacts for safekeeping. According to his journals, this location would only be accessible during a rare planetary alignment that occurred once every 187 years, and that alignment was scheduled to happen in just 3 months. As Sarah prepared for the Swiss expedition, she found herself thinking often about Tommy Whitmore and the chain of events that had led to this moment. The boy's simple act of curiosity, digging around the ruins despite being told to stay away, had unlocked a mystery that spanned continents and centuries, but there was one aspect of the story that still troubled her. In his final journal entries, St. Aldrich had written about the price of guardianship and the sacrifice that must be made by those who protect the sacred treasures. Tommy's death from influenza just a year after finding the reliquary seemed to fit this pattern, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was a darker side to St. Aldrich's legacy. Her concerns were heightened when she received a visit from Dr. Margaret Thornton, who had been studying the psychological effects of the discoveries on the various people involved in the excavations. "Sarah, I need to share something with you," Margaret said, her expression grave. "I've been tracking the health and well-being of everyone who has had direct contact with the artifacts, and I'm seeing some disturbing patterns." "What kind of patterns?" "Several of the researchers have reported having vivid dreams about St. Aldrich and the monastery. Some have claimed to see apparitions or receive what they believe are messages from the past, and 3 of the team members have developed serious illnesses that their doctors can't explain." Sarah felt a chill of unease. "Are you suggesting that the artifacts are somehow dangerous?" "I'm suggesting that there might be more to St. Aldrich's guardianship system than we understand. Perhaps the artifacts don't just require astronomical conditions to be found. Perhaps they also require a human cost." This possibility cast Tommy Whitmore's story in an even more tragic light. Had the boy's death been not just a coincidence, but an actual requirement of the guardianship system? Had St. Aldrich's network been preserved through the centuries by a series of human sacrifices, people who gave their lives to protect the treasures? Sarah was wrestling with these disturbing questions when she received an unexpected phone call from Switzerland. Dr. Klaus Weber, the archaeologist who was preparing the site for their expedition, had made a discovery that changed everything. "Dr. Chen, you need to come to Switzerland immediately," he said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "We've found something that wasn't on any of the maps, something that suggests St. Aldrich's story is far from over." Sarah flew to Switzerland the next day, leaving her team to continue their research in England. The monastery of St. Bernhard was located high in the Alps, accessible only by a treacherous mountain road that wound through some of the most spectacular scenery in Europe. Dr. Weber met her at the small village at the base of the mountain, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Sarah, what we've found up there, it's going to change everything we thought we knew about St. Aldrich." The monastery ruins were even more remote and mysterious than those in England. Perched on a rocky outcrop thousands of feet above sea level, the ancient buildings seemed to cling to the mountainside like something from a fairy tale. But it was what Dr. Weber had found in the monastery's crypt that took Sarah's breath away. "We discovered this chamber 3 days ago," he explained, leading her down a narrow stone staircase that descended deep into the mountain. "It's not marked on any of the historical plans, and it's sealed with the same astronomical locks that you found in England." The chamber was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The walls were covered with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story, and in the center of the room stood a stone altar that glowed with the same faint luminescence they had observed in the English chapel. But it was the figure carved into the altar that made Sarah gasp in recognition. It was St. Aldrich, but not as she had seen him depicted before. This carving showed him as a much older man, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries and hands that were raised in what appeared to be a gesture of both blessing and warning. "There's an inscription," Dr. Weber said, pointing to Latin text carved around the base of the altar. "It's a message from St. Aldrich, but it's addressed to someone specific." Sarah knelt beside the altar and read the inscription, her knowledge of medieval Latin allowing her to translate the ancient words. "To she who follows the path of the young guardian, who seeks the truth behind the treasures, the final secret awaits, but beware the price of knowledge. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." The message was clearly meant for her. Somehow, across 12 centuries, St. Aldrich had known that she would be the one to follow Tommy Whitmore's discovery to its ultimate conclusion. "There's more," Dr. Weber said, leading her to another section of the chamber. "We found this behind the altar." It was another stone box, similar to those they had found in England, but larger and more elaborate. The astronomical symbols carved into its surface were unlike any they had seen before, and the lock mechanism appeared to be far more complex. "According to our calculations, this box can only be opened during the planetary alignment next month," Dr. Weber explained. "But Sarah, there's something else. The inscription suggests that opening this final cache will complete St. Aldrich's plan, but it will also end the guardianship system forever." Sarah studied the mysterious box, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on her. Everything that had started with Tommy Whitmore's curiosity in 1918 was leading to this moment, this final revelation that would either vindicate St. Aldrich's centuries-long plan or destroy it completely. But as she stood in the ancient chamber, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and mystery of the ages, Sarah realized that she had no choice but to see the journey through to its end. Tommy Whitmore had started something that she was meant to finish, and whatever the cost, she would honor the trust that had been passed down through the generations. The planetary alignment was still weeks away, but Sarah knew that when the time came, she would open St. Aldrich's final cache and discover the ultimate truth behind the treasures that had shaped so many lives across the centuries. As she prepared to leave the chamber, Sarah took one last look at the carving of St. Aldrich on the altar. For just a moment, she could have sworn that the ancient saint's stone eyes moved, looking directly at her with an expression of both gratitude and warning. The boy with the toy in the 1918 photograph had set in motion events that were about to reach their climax. And Sarah Chen, the modern guardian of ancient secrets, was about to discover whether some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. The circle that had begun with Tommy Whitmore was about to close, and the world would never be the same. Epilogue. 1 month later, as the planets aligned in the Swiss sky, Dr. Sarah Chen opened St. Aldrich's final cache and discovered the truth that had been hidden for over a millennium. Inside the stone box was not treasure, but knowledge, a complete record of an ancient network of scholars who had preserved humanity's spiritual heritage through the darkest periods of history. The price that St. Aldrich had written about was not death, but responsibility, the burden of carrying forward the wisdom of the ages and ensuring that it would never be lost. Tommy Whitmore had paid that price by giving his life to protect the reliquary, and now Sarah understood that she had inherited the same sacred duty. The photograph of the boy with his toy now hangs in Sarah's office at Cambridge, a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the curiosity of a child and the wisdom of those who came before. The treasures of St. Aldrich continue to reveal their secrets, but the greatest treasure of all is the knowledge that there are always guardians watching over humanity's most precious inheritance. And somewhere, in the space between time and eternity, the spirits of St. Aldrich and Tommy Whitmore continue their eternal watch, ensuring that the light of knowledge will never be extinguished.